Start recording, and welcome everyone to our Tuesday gardening series. We had to pivot a little bit, but we're doing all virtual today, but that's fine. I think it actually worked out because otherwise we'd have a delivery being unloaded right next to the talk right now. So apparently PlantWorks is delivering all of our fall and winter annuals right now.
Oh my goodness.
But I think that's going on. But we'd like to welcome you here, and I definitely would like to welcome Shannon Currey. I've known you've been with Hoffman for how long now?
In February it'll be 15 years. So I know, kind of crazy.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Indeed.
Just a brief thing. Hoffman Nursery, they're a wholesale nursery, so it's not something that the general public is going to show up at, but I can think of no better people in the plant industry than John and Jill Hoffman. They are just phenomenal people. They support research, they support students, they support everything. They're just great people, and it's a top-notch nursery. Odds are, if you've got any ornamental grasses in your garden, there's a pretty good chance it originated out of North Carolina in Rougemont.
Yeah.
So, and I'm excited to have Shannon talk about some ornamental grasses. What's interesting is it kind of ties back. We started adding some ornamental grasses into the formal gardens, and someone commented that, sorry, I've got a dog scratching in here. That's not me. But someone commented that, there weren't grasses in the formal garden. And, I pointed out that ornamental grasses really didn't get popular until the 80s. So yeah, they wouldn't have been on the 1917 plan. But they're a great addition to the gardens, and, they're just workhorses, everything from texture to covering, green mulch. And Shannon's going to do a fantastic job of kind of opening your eyes to, what grasses and grass-like plants can do for you in the garden. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shannon.
Great.
Myself, so the puppies don't get involved in that.
We love you. If you take the Rothlings, you take the puppies too, right?
Yes.
That's the deal. Well, thank you, John. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and work on sharing my screen as we get into this and make sure you can see that okay. Ornamental grass toolbox. Great. Okay. And I really am delighted to be here. I so appreciate John asking me to do this, and also appreciate the pivot from in-person to virtual. It just with arrangements and logistics, it was just a whole lot easier to do that from my home office where I'm working remotely, but can't wait to get out to Reynolda sometime very soon. So I'm going to I've got a lot of material to cover. I'm going to be very optimistic about my ability to cover it in the time we have. If you have questions, you can hop onto the chat. Maybe the easiest way. I'll try to keep an eye out, and John can help out too and chime in. I may try to get through as much as I can, and then we can leave questions for the end. But if something's really not clear, or you feel like it's just really timely, please do jump in on that chat. And so, as John said, I'm with Hoffman Nursery. And we have been in the grass business for, at this point, 35 years. The nursery was founded in 1986, and we are wholesale only, as John mentioned. And we specialize in, we grow what's called a liner or a plug, which you can see in this. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer here. Yeah, which you see right here on the bottom right. So it's a smaller size that we pot up. We sell to other nurseries who then pot it up to a larger size, or we sell it to landscape contractors who put that into the ground, a little bit to retail, but essentially we're pretty far back in the production process for most of the grasses that you would see at retail. And we specialize, as John mentioned, in grasses, sedges, and grass-like plants. That's all that we do. And so it is what some folks refer to as ornamental grasses. So it's what you see there, not turf grass. So not turf grass. That's a whole separate field. We really look at ornamental and native grasses. And what we have seen very much over the past decades is an enormous increase in popularity of grasses. You see them in our public spaces all over the place. Both these photos are from the Sassafras All Children's Playground in Raleigh, which really features a ton of grasses all around the play areas and the public spaces. You see them in public parks and along roadsides, and even you see here in the middle, this is in the River Arts District in Asheville. They've underplanted on these kind of hell strips, we call them, along the roadside with sedges and put perennials into that. At the Arboretum in Asheville as well, and on the Battery in New York City. Even simple parking lot plantings can make a big difference. And that's where you see grasses being used more and more in these public spaces. And gardens like the Lurie Garden in Chicago's Millennium Park are incredibly popular. And people see these designs in these public spaces that use grasses so beautifully. The High Line in Manhattan is Pete Aldoff's work that is one of the most famous gardens in the US now. And in fact, I believe is the most visited site in New York City now. Also in spaces like this bioretention planter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that are workhorse areas that are doing the job of managing stormwater, are using grasses and are beautiful. Or the Rose Kennedy Greenway here in Boston. These layered plantings that take advantage of grasses and other herbaceous materials do things like manage stormwater in this parking lot planting. So if you can see here, there's a curb cut where all of the runoff from this Indianapolis Museum of Art parking lot goes into this bioretention planter. Even simple plantings are utilizing grasses to really do more for the landscape. And we see that grasses now are really more popular than ever. We've seen a resurgence even over the past few years. It really is prime time for grasses. And when you look at some of the trends out there, it really reinforces that popularity of grasses. So this is a survey of landscape architects, and it's a listing of what their clients are asking for, and so what they see as the trends. And I've put in dark green a number of these trends that are out there: native plants, drought tolerant plants, low maintenance landscapes. All of these dark green ones in particular are where grasses really shine, and I'll talk about some of these areas and why grasses really fit. But I think these trends that we're seeing are part of what are driving the popularity of grasses. And the reason for that is that you really can do more with grasses and sedges. And we'll talk more about all of these aspects, but they require fewer inputs to look good and to do well. They reduce reed pressure. They help increase infiltration. So there are a host of benefits to using grasses and sedges in the landscape that I think are part of what's driving that popularity. Another big area of in the landscape world is called green infrastructure. And so that's kind of a big blanket term, but the US EPA defines it as using vegetation, soils, and natural processes. It's a way to manage stormwater and manage water in ways that create healthier urban environments. So taking, for example, this space that's on NC State's campus between two dormitories and converting it into a space with added ecological function. So they took this space, redeveloped it using plants and soils and these natural bioswale systems and harvesting rainwater to add ecological function. It might be in this garden in Brookside, this parking lot, in Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland. They're harvesting all of the water off of their parking lots and putting it into these bioswales that are supported by layered plantings and adding function to that landscape. Green infrastructure is also green roofs. So building up and adding ecological function to our roofing areas. This is in Asheville, a beautiful living roof created by Living Roofs, Inc. It might also be just replacing typical traditional turf grass with a meadow or a prairie planting. So this is in St. Louis, where office workers can look outside and see a much more vibrant, engaging landscape than just ornamental not turf grass. Green infrastructure has many, many different elements. As I mentioned, might be green roofs, it might be water harvesting. In many cases, just conserving what is there. But I would argue that any of our managed urban landscapes are in fact green infrastructure. So all of the spaces around us are green infrastructure. And I think that's important in the context of understanding what our landscapes do for us and what plants do for us. And part of the popularity of grasses, I think, is tied into understanding more broadly that plants aren't just pretty. There really are economic, environmental, and health benefits to plants. It's not just about looking good. It's beyond aesthetics. Dr. Charlie Hall, who's a professor at Texas A&M University, has done a great literature review about some of these benefits. And just a few of them I'll point out. We know we can reduce and clean stormwater runoff with green spaces and using plants in those systems, as you've already seen in some of the slides. We can reduce energy consumption by using plants. Green roofs help reduce heating and cooling costs and help us manage stormwater. We can support and sustain wildlife. We can reduce stress and improve our health, improve memory and concentration. So if I see some of you I see some of your cameras on, if you have a plant inside with you, or you're sitting outside, you may remember 20% more information than if you had not had a green plant in there with you or outside. So they can help with learning and all kinds of aspects of our social behavior. Also reduce heat island effects. So there are all these really wonderful benefits to plants. And so when we're looking at any kind of site that's out there, adding that ecological function has become really important. But with any site, there are some common issues that confront us. So it might be that there's a low spot in your yard that never dries out, that you can't get turf grass to grow in shade. We all know that's a futile errand to try to get that to happen. Also, drought is becoming an increasingly difficult problem for us. But that often is balanced by, or not balanced. In this case, it's we have these heavy rain events with drought in between. So really increasingly extreme weather events and dealing with those. So there may be a spot in your yard that washes out every time there's a hard rain. Also, there are areas that are too steep to mow. So there are hillsides where you're trying to plant something and turf grass where you can mow it is really difficult. In addition to some of these issues, there are aspirations that we have for our landscape. So there are functions we want to add or more that we want to have our landscape do, like you want to mow less often. We understand that mowing takes up tremendous amounts of resources in terms of fossil fuels and carbon emissions and noise pollution, air pollution. So there are lots of ways that mowing less often is a real plus. And as much as I enjoy a little Zen weeding, I don't want to spend all my time weeding, and I especially don't want to use chemicals in order to control that if I can help it. We just want our landscapes to do more ecologically. And that's where we want to understand how grasses can help our landscapes do more. And to do that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time digging more deeply into aspects of grasses themselves. How do you manage them? And then we'll get to some specific grasses and some functions in the landscape. So we got to kind of set things up first and then dig more deeply into the specific grasses. So a couple of definitions first. Excuse me, and I'll stop there and just make sure there are no really pertinent questions at the moment. It looks like the chat's quiet, so I'll move ahead. And I'll stop at the end of this sequence to just see if there are any questions about some of this more fundamental grass stuff. So let's start with true grasses. They are in the Poaceae family, and it has the widest distribution of all flowering plant families in the world. And you find it in almost every terrestrial ecosystem out there. And as such, grasses have adapted to survive under some fairly difficult conditions. And we'll talk about some of those adaptations. One of those is a highly efficient fibrous root system. So grasses do have branching roots. They tend to go very deep where the soil will allow it. They can do some remarkable things with that root system, which I'll mention. Also, most grasses in general tend to do best in full sun. Similar to grasses, but in a very different family. So these are grass-like plants, but are in the Cyperaceae family, is a very large genus called Carex. These are also distributed throughout the world. In fact, there are over 2,000 species throughout the world. And in the US, there are over 400 species that are found native that are east of the Mississippi. So a huge genus. What is very interesting to me is that even with such a great genus or a large genus, all of those Carex are herbaceous perennials. So you don't find any woody ones or vining ones or anything. They're all herbaceous perennials, which is really unusual for a genus of that size. So something notable about them. Because it's such a large genus, they range from shade loving to sun tolerant. There's really no one aspect of sun, although most of the sedges that are in the horticultural trade are mostly shade loving plants. And one key feature too in understanding grasses in particular is their growth cycle. So grasses in general are divided into cool season and warm season. And those general categories are sort of kind of a heuristic for thinking about other physiological processes. Their photosynthetic processes are different. Specifically, cool season plants use a C3 photosynthetic process. C4 plants layer an additional process on top of that. So they're called C4 plants, excuse me. C3 for cool season, C4 for warm season. I won't get into the specifics. I am not a botanist, but just an overview to help you understand how you might manage and work with these plants. Cool season plants and cool season grasses specifically grow best when soil and air temperatures are relatively cool. So they have a flush of growth early in the spring when temperatures are cool. So they grow quickly. As the temperatures start to warm up, though, they slow down. And during the heat of summer, they're not growing very much. In fact, some aren't actively growing. They almost go dormant, not completely like a winter dormancy, but they slow down and are not actively growing. As those temperatures start to rise later in summer and into fall, they get a second flush of growth. Conversely, warm season grasses are super efficient. They photosynthesize best at higher temperatures, so 70s, 80s, 90s, and they get a flush of, they're slow in the spring. They're establishing a root system early on when it's cooler, but as the temperatures rise, they start to grow like gangbusters. So during the heat of the summer, that's when they're growing, putting on a lot of biomass and growing really efficiently. Warm season grasses are more efficient. That C4 photosynthetic process is more efficient, especially at high temperatures. And so they can take the same amount of water, nutrients, and sunlight and grow twice as much biomass as an equivalent cool season grass could. They just have that much more potential and have greater efficiency. The trick is that's at high temperatures. So the summertime is really their best season for putting on growth. As the temperatures drop, they start to edge in toward winter dormancy. So one of the key things to note too is that I said you have cool and warm season grasses. One key thing to note is that all of the Carex that I mentioned, the sedges, are cool season growers. So they're going to have that cool season growth cycle. Grasses, on the other hand, you have both cool season and warm season. In general, a lot of the grasses that are out there in the horticultural trade, what you could get at retail, tend to be warm season. And most of the ones I'll talk about today are warm. I'll try to make sure I note it, but if there's a question, I'll try to certainly chime in, or I'll try to mention if there's an exception to that. So the warm season plants, as I mentioned, they're putting a lot of initial energy into root growth. And that's where the grasses are really shining when I mentioned that fibrous root system. So let me get my cursor off the screen here so I can make sure I'm hitting my right spot. So what I want to point out, this is the root systems of prairie plants. This illustration has been around for a long time, and most of you have probably seen this. And it goes down to maybe 15 feet. And that only happens in silty loam. We know that in North Carolina, most of our plants like this are going to spread out more horizontally because they can't go deeply. But what I want to note is that red arrow is turf grass. And you can see that really, really thin layer of roots there. What you see in these native species of grasses is a deep fibrous root system that I mentioned before. And that has some real benefits when you look at sites and using them in the landscape. For one thing, they really help slow and filter runoff. So the grass I'm showing you there is a switchgrass, a Panicum virgatum, that has a really dense crown. And that root system has been cut off pretty shallowly, but you can see that dense system of roots. They're all branching out. That helps hold in the soil. It helps slow and filter the runoff that is going over the soil system. It goes through that crown. As the roots get down into the soil profile, that helps increase infiltration. So you let water get down into the soil rather than running off more. That helps to reduce erosion. And that plant also does not die back to the ground like a lot of herbaceous perennials do. So grasses stay upright. They keep their habit for the most part when they're dormant. And that also helps capture rainwater and slow water that's running across the ground. And also that root system is perpetually reinvigorating itself. So some of the roots die off each season, you'll get new root growth, and that helps store carbon in the soils. So there's a lot of ways that grasses can help improve the site with that fibrous root system. And so when you think about a slope where erosion control is an issue, where mowing is really difficult, or in fact dangerous in some cases, you might do something like this on a university campus where they planted a really nice mix of grasses and forbs and wildflowers. Rather than having to mow it, they can cut it down once a year. And also some other considerations with grasses and sedges when you're working with the soil. Most of the grasses out there that are in the trade really are tolerant of low fertility. I mentioned that our warm season grasses tend to be very efficient. And that's the case with nutrients in the soil profile. So with just a few nutrients, they can do very well. So a lot of them will grow quite well under low fertility conditions. In addition, they tend to be adaptable to a wide range of pH. They're not fussy about that pH. So unless you get way outside the normal ranges of like super alkaline soil or very acidic soil, they tend to do pretty well and not be fussy about it. And so that means that you often don't need amendments when you're planting grasses. Some of the sedges appreciate a more organic mix, and so you might add some compost, but grasses in general don't necessarily need that to do well. You can add compost and they'll grow well, but they don't necessarily need it. One thing that grasses do tend to need, though, is good drainage, especially in winter. Part of that is letting those warm season grasses get established before they go into a cold, wet winter. And good drainage will help them do that, which is a good segue into planting grasses. As I mentioned, the soil prep depends on the species. For many, you may not need to add amendments to the soil. And when you're planting, you want to plant at the soil level. So right where, this is with the liner, but it applies even to larger sizes, you don't want to bury that grass below the soil line. You want to plant it at, or maybe even slightly above it. And it has to do with what I mentioned a minute ago about letting that plant get established before it goes into winter. Ideally, that plant has established some root system and the crown is free of mulch. You can let air circulate during the growing season, and also in the winter time, that it's well drained. So you're not getting a lot of moisture staying in that crown. It's not buried in mulch. It's not covered in soil, so that reduces the probability that fungal diseases would be a problem, especially here in the Southeast. As we know, fungal diseases are a big part of what we battle in the Southeast. And so reducing the chances that those will have an opportunity to thrive is part of that planting at soil level, providing good drainage, and not mulching right on top of them. When you're planting too, just a couple of notes: you want irrigation to establish. That first season, it's fine to water, but we usually don't need to after that. Another note is you want to avoid planting too late in the season with certain warm season grasses like pink muley grass, for example, that's when you really want to get established. So a good rule of thumb is maybe putting warm season grasses in at least 6 weeks ahead of the first hard freeze, wherever you are. So for that in North Carolina, that means, getting those in already. It may be a little bit late for some of these warm season grasses to plant. It doesn't mean they won't be okay, but you just reduce the probability that they're going to overwinter well that first season. Moving on to water use. So when we're talking about warm season grasses, as I said, they're very efficient. So most of those you can water that first year to get established, but after that, they don't necessarily need supplemental irrigation to survive. If you want them to look really good, you may want to provide supplemental irrigation during drought times. But in general, if you overwater grasses, they can have a lot of lush growth, and that can cause them to flop. So they're actually pretty efficient. That's why they're great for areas that may be difficult for some other plants. The cool thing about that warm season photosynthetic process is that those grasses will do well without water, but when it's present, they will soak it up like crazy. So they're very efficient. So they're okay without a lot of water, but they can soak it up when it's there. And that makes them great for situations where you've got both wet and dry, like in a rain garden. Sedge species have a wide range. There's no good way to say they have this kind of water use because it's all over the place. And so I'll talk about some of those individual plants as we move through. Also, grasses and sedges have a pretty short to-do list. For many, as I've mentioned, there's no need for supplemental fertilization or irrigation after that first year. Mostly pest and disease free. In general, fungal diseases are going to be your biggest challenge. And that's where providing good air circulation, making sure they're in relatively well-drained soils, and not mulching too heavy around that crown or at all if you can. I will talk about a few of these grasses that do fine no matter where you put them, like switchgrasses, they can take it. Also, in terms of the to-do list, cutting back grasses once yearly in late winter is just a good cultural practice. They can do without it, but it helps with removing thatch or reducing thatch over time, because if you get too much dead material in that crown, it kind of harks back to what I mentioned earlier. You want to have good air circulation in that crown. So you want to get some of that out. So cutting back yearly. If you are concerned about wildlife, and I know a lot of us are, you can leave it a little bit taller to allow for native bees to nest into those stems. So there's some ways that you can manage and still cut back and attend to both the grasses and the creatures that are out there. With sedges, because they are cool season plants, they grow a little more slowly. And so those I would cut back less often because it takes them longer to recover. So maybe every 2 to 3 years. Or if after winter, they're looking kind of ratty and they're in a spot where that's of concern, you can go ahead and cut them back every year. And then finally, in this middle section where I'm just talking about these considerations, also with grasses and sedges, you want to think about it as building a community. And they're an important part of that. People tend to think about flowers and obvious flowers when thinking about pollinators, but grasses flower too. And many of them are hosts for some of our pollinator plants. So there are little bluestem, for example, is a host for skipper butterflies. Some of our, as I mentioned, some of our warm season grasses can serve as nesting material for native bees. Birds use the grasses as the leaves as nesting material. So there are all kinds of support for wildlife that grasses provide because they are part of a greater community. They also allow cover for birds and small mammals that can forage and escape from predators. And here's a real plus: deer tend to avoid them. They're not completely resistant because we know no plant is, but they are some of the last plants on a deer menu, especially the grasses. Okay, I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions, because I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Everybody doing okay? Okay. Great. See nothing in the chat at the moment. So now let's get to finding some solutions in our grass toolbox. So what's out there? What can we work with? And I'm going to start this sequence with looking at what I think of as this is a typical landscape and not necessarily, the front of the house. This is in my neighborhood in Durham, and this is on a major road, and the house is in this picture is back behind. This is the backyard of a house where their front yard's on the other side. They put up a fence. Then we've got, crepe myrtles here and some mulching and turf grass. And then here's the curve and the roadside. And in order to manage this space, they're mulching every fall and spring. They're putting down mulch, they're weeding, or in some cases they're spraying. This was taken, I think last winter, and was after they just sprayed. And so you can see the residual, the dead weeds there. They're mowing this space down below. So if they're spraying herbicides, which is happening, maybe they're doing pesticides, but any water that's coming off that hillside is running into the street and going into the stormwater system. So you've got also potentially some erosion if the mulch isn't there on time. There's a little bit of wildlife support, but not a lot. So the activities on this site don't really enhance ecological function. I think this space is doing some important things ecologically, but it's not contributing as much as it could be. And I think this site illustrates some of those common issues that confront us that I mentioned before: turf grass growing in shade. This may wash every time there's rainfall. This is a little tough to deal with. You can't really mow this, but you've got to manage, got to mulch this thing. And also, as I said, we've got some aspirations. So these are some common issues and some common aspirations. So what can we do to address these issues that we've realized, or and realize those goals? How can we add ecological value? And so to do that, I'm going to talk about 3 functions today, and specific grasses that will address some of these. So covering the ground, managing water where it falls, and choosing plants and planting for resilience and good looks. And in that last section, I'll try to also touch on some of the ways that the horticultural industry is trying to select and breed for resilience and good looks in the landscape so that we can add that value. So let's start with covering the ground. And we want to do that, but we want to cover the ground with something that is low growing with minimal inputs, that reduces weed competition. So we're not having to do a lot of weeding or spraying or dealing with that. We want to slow and treat runoff. We want to increase the amount of water that infiltrates down into the ground, retain the soil, reduce erosion, and provide wildlife habitat. We want to supercharge this landscape ecologically. We want to go beyond mulch and traditional turf grass and create a living mulch that will manage all of those functions for us. And the way we do that is to cover the ground. And in ground covering, I like to think of, there's sort of different language we can use. And functionally, though, I want to talk about, I think there are 2 general ways to think about this for me. Ground covers and lawn alternatives are just large sweeps of the same plant. A ground cover is more variable in visual texture, whereas a lawn alternative is something that you might mow periodically. So it's more uniform. It's a look that you might get with traditional turf grass, but not quite the same functionality. It might handle light foot traffic, but you're not going to be playing bocce or soccer on this. It's something that will function, do those other ecological functions, but not necessarily foot traffic. This is a place where you'd want to mow maybe 2 to 3 times a year, and you're mowing quite high, so at 3 to 8 inches. And that reduces the amount of resources that go into managing that space. So large sweeps. The other way to think about covering the ground to me is really a planting matrix. And this is the language that's used quite a bit in a lot of the planting design that's out there. I showed you plantings from Pete Aldoff, from Claudia West and Thomas Rayner, whose book illustration I'm using right here. The idea of a planting matrix is to have this ground cover layer below that really is a base layer. It might be other ground level species, so not just grasses and sedges, but maybe some other herbaceous perennials. But at this layer, you're planting into it, and it's providing a lot of the ecological function. So it's slowing the stormwater, covering the ground, reducing weed pressure. And then you have these other layers of herbaceous perennials here, a seasonal theme, where you might put in flowering plants that are showier and providing that wow and that pop of color on a seasonal rotation. And then this structural layer on the top that provides those bones, the architectural structure for that plant community. But you're really building a plant community. This ground layer is your workhorse layer. I also think of them as the backup singers of the horticultural world. These aren't the stars of the show. But what they're doing is providing backup. They're tying everything together. They're letting the melody sing and come forth, but they're really providing the foundation for everything. And so when you look at plantings like these, you've got a matrix layer underneath, and other plants are the stars, are providing that color, and they really make those landscapes pop. And you can get at higher levels of complexity. So these really diverse plantings that are just beautiful. And you can see these landscapes here. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few specific selections. This is not all of the ones that are out there, but just a few, so that we can get through all of this and get to some questions. But I'll identify some that I think are good exemplars that fit these functions. Our most popular native sedge by far is Carex pennsylvanica. This is Pennsylvania sedge, and it really is one of those backup singers. It has narrow green blades, but it is the background that to me actually really does sing. The picture you see there is at Elk Knob State Park up north of Boone, near Todd, North Carolina, and is just gorgeous. This landscape always just relaxes me to hike through this and to see this beautiful carpet. That's Carex pennsylvanica. It is a very well-behaved spreader, so it forms that nice carpet. It's one that I wouldn't say can handle foot traffic, really. It's really more for that aesthetic, but providing all kinds of wildlife support. Carex pennsylvanica supports 35 different species of caterpillars. So that's some pretty heavy ecological workforce going on there. This is one that works best in cooler climates. So if you're in gardening in Winston-Salem, in that area, you probably have a pretty good chance if you move into the Piedmont. It can do okay here for us. I'll show you this stand is at the Nursery. And we are in the Piedmont, but during the heat of summer, it's going to look a little bit tired. It really looks its freshest and best in the spring and gets a flush in late fall. And in cooler climates in the mountains, it thrives, as you saw from there. So that's one of our most popular ones. Looking at something similar, so a fine textured sedge with green blades that can handle a little bit more pressure from heat is Carex texensis. So this is long blades. This will tolerate light foot traffic. One of the biggest differences is also in terms of being a little more able to tolerate our more difficult conditions in the Piedmont is that this is not the same kind of spreader. It's more of a clumper. It's not going to give you that carpet. We're still, as an industry, looking for the sedge that can take more full sun and can give you that carpet look, but we're not quite there yet. Carex texensis, I love. It's being used in some landscapes as this underplanting. So more of that ground cover layer, that underplanting larger woody plants and provides that ground cover. And I wanted to show you where Carex texensis is native. It's not just Texas, in spite of the name. You do find it throughout the Southeast. And here's another photo. I wanted you to see it when it's dormant. This is during the winter time. You can see it just forms that nice dormant layer. It can be cut or left long. Another photo shows it. This is in Duke Gardens, where they left it long on this hillside and are using it just by the edge of a water. It does take some time to establish. Sedges do tend to be more slow growing than grasses do. So these are some plugs that were planted in Duke Gardens. And this is just, I think they were planted in the fall, and this is the next spring as they're coming out. So it may take a little bit of a while to get that really lovely carpet, but over time you will see that. Another fine textured sedge that's green is Carex divulsa. Now, this is a Eurasian species. So if you are looking for native species, you want to probably steer away from this, but it is a fantastic grower. It thrives under established trees. It tolerates a range of soil conditions and handles just those very difficult conditions that we sometimes find, especially in parking lots or some other areas. This one I love because it is nice and thick and vigorous. It will spread by some reseeding. So if you are in an area where you're concerned about spreading, this is one I would avoid, especially if you're really focusing on native species. It is a very strong grower. It is one of the best for dry shades though, dry shade. It has a nice, neat, tidy habit. So that's why really it's good in some managed landscapes. Carex divulsa also is, I'm showing you here on Glenwood Avenue in Raleigh. They've used it as an underplanting as well. So that's another one of those, narrow leafed green sedges that are backup singers, but do a lot of great work. Moving to another sedge that I think does fantastic as that ground cover or underplanting layer is bunny blue sedge. I love it because in spite of this lush, gorgeous look, it really is a very tough sedge. It has wide blue foliage and it is happiest in moist organic soils, but it is super tough and will handle even very dry conditions. So I wouldn't put it in full sun, but in partial sun, especially if you could push a little bit more moisture, it will do very well. Excuse me. A very similar species is Carex flacosperma. They have slightly different geographic ranges, but for us in North Carolina, they're really quite similar. This is a planting in my own yard here in Durham. And on the left, you'll see it's blooming in early spring, which is when most Carex for us bloom. And I haven't cut it back. I didn't do anything to it. That's going through one of our, fairly typical winters. And it's looking to me pretty good. And then later on, you'll see it in the spring. Once you can see sort of the spent seed heads, this is as it's gotten its flush of growth after blooming. So I think it looks quite nice there. And I'll show you Carex flacosperma. This is at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And this is in December. I was up there giving a talk and it still looked quite nice, even after, having gone through a few freezes. It was doing quite well for them and is mostly evergreen. Moving on to another sedge for that ground cover layer is Carex cherokeensis. This is one of the toughest sedges in our trial gardens. It has been a real workhorse. It has medium textured foliage, so a little bit broader blade than the ones I've been showing you prior to bunny blue. It's definitely taller. It's a little bit wilder look, a little more naturalistic, but it is very disease resistant and it is a tough, tough grower. I'll show you the range on this is mainly in the southeast. We're pushing it up a little further north to see how far it will go, but they're using it at the North Carolina Arboretum in Asheville. I'll show you that picture here in a moment. The caveat I have for Carex cherokeensis is it is an assertive sedge. It will reseed and it tends to form colonies by reseeding and by short rhizomes. So this is one that I'd put it where you either want it to spread and form a colony, like in a rain garden, let's say, or in a more managed landscape like this is at the Arboretum in Asheville. They're using it as this ground cover in sun, and here they can manage it, they can keep it contained. I found that I've had to edit out some Carex cherokeensis in some of my smaller beds where it's kind of pushing out other plants. So it can be a little bit of a bully, but in a place where you really want that coverage, where you want it to hold in soil and really do its job, it's a great plant. I'm showing it to you here at Dew Gardens. You can see it here as a ground cover, or they've used it also in these places where they really want to hold into the soil and where mowing is very difficult. On the left, that's just from last month. So in, oh gosh, I said last month, August, actually, last month now is September. But you can see it's been blooming, it's holding into soil there. And this is a picture of it in the dead of winter. On this steep slope, You can see it's got it's not fully evergreen, but it's still staying there and doing its job. So a really tough sedge in the right spot. All right, I'll move along to some wrapping up some more ground covers. I'll also mention the Evercolor series of sedges. These are also really good, strong growers. These are, this is an Asian species. They're derived mainly from the Oshamensis group. And I'll show you a new one that's a Moroi, but these are great for shady conditions, and they are evergreen where they're hardy, which is into zone 6. So they're fantastic for a pop of color, something a little showier. And these actually can be the stars of the show in many cases. And they're fantastic in containers as well, not just in the ground. So I'll show you a few of these. This is a series that's been really popular, and they're really good growers and provide some really easy care ground covers. The newest addition for us is Everglow. This is a Carex Moroi that gets this really pretty orange color into the late summer and fall. And I'll show you a couple of shots of it used as a ground cover. And again, that pop of color is really one of the best aspects of this series. And so you can see the chartreuse color. I see Everillo. This is the chartreuse selection here all over the place now. And wrapping up the ground covers with a couple of grasses, because not everybody has shade. This is for full sun. Eragrostis spectabilis is purple love grass. This is a native species that you find growing in open sunny fields. It loves dry, rocky soils, not a lot of water. So this is one in a dry area, but really spectacular as a ground cover. At the Sassafras All Children's Playground in Raleigh that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk, this is one of their ground cover plants. It's a go-to for them. So even this is in August, it's bloomed in early June and early summer and still looks really nice and is providing great support as a ground cover there. And in our trial gardens at the nursery, you can see it is fully dormant here and still doing its job of covering the ground. And the last grass I'll mention for ground cover is Prairie Dropseed, Spirobos Heterolipus. This is one of my favorite grasses, very fine textured, a lovely mounding habit, and gives outstanding fall color, which I'll show you in a couple of slides. This is one that is, in spite of being a warm season prairie grass, it takes a little bit longer to establish. It's one you need to plant either spring or late summer at the latest, because it takes a while to get established in the fall. So when you're planting, you really want to be cautious with fall planting, and give it 3 seasons, maybe 4 to get to maturity. But gosh, it is worth the wait. Interestingly enough, this is mainly a Midwestern species, or the Great Plains, but there's a population in Western North Carolina, and it is used throughout a large part of the country. It is the matrix planting, so that ground layer in the Lurie Garden in Chicago's Millennium Park. It is also, you can see it at Chanticleer in Pennsylvania as this just gorgeously breathtaking meadow. Just is really lovely and has great fall color. And I'll mention, and I'm going to go more quickly because I got some more ground to cover, literally. Here are a few of the companion perennials. And these are some that I've used a lot. Some of these shots you can see are actually from my home garden. And these are plants that do really well with a lot of the species I've mentioned. And I've got some references at the end where you can find some of these plant lists. The second function I want to talk about is managing water where it falls. And this is, and what I mean by that is, rather than piping water like you see here, down into maybe a stormwater system, let's try to treat it in our landscapes. Managing water, let it fall on the roof, but then go out into the landscape and manage it with something like a rain garden, where we can filter out pollutants. We can manage that water rather than putting it untreated into the stormwater system. And we can do that beautifully. I showed you this photo earlier. This is from the Denver Botanic Gardens at Chatfield Farms. In this rain garden area, they're handling all of the stormwater runoff from their parking lots. And we can do that with rain gardens and bioswales. So just noting, because we could do a whole talk about rain gardens, that what's needed here are not wetland plants, but the plants that can handle both wet and dry conditions, because that's what happens in a rain garden, that sometimes it will dry out, but you need it to be able to soak up the water, hold it and soak up the water when it does rain and you have heavy rain events. Or in the case of a bioswale, that it's slowing the water so that it can infiltrate more and filter out pollutants. And we can do that with these beautiful plantings like at Brookside Gardens, where they're using this as that ground cover layer or in a layered planting. A few plants I'll mention for that. Juncus effusus, while not a sedge or a grass, is one that we do grow as a grass-like plant. I mentioned this one because it's mostly evergreen and it is a powerhouse ecologically because it provides wildlife cover. It provides nesting sites for birds. It's food for mammals and insects and all kinds of different creatures. So it really is a plant that should be included in any kind of rain garden or bioswale. And it's just a fantastic grass-like plant. A sedge I'll mention too in this context is Carex amphibula. This is creek sedge. This is a widespread sedge. You find it all across the eastern US. And often when a plant is as widespread as it is, that suggests adaptability. So you find it in lots of different ecosystems, or it handles lots of different kinds of conditions. And that's the case for creek sedge. It's a great grower. It forms this nice little neat bunch. It'll spread out, but very slowly. And it is mostly evergreen. I have it here on the photo you see is in my home garden. It's in a layered planting where I've got Baptisia, I've got irises in there and some Heliopsis and some other plants that it's providing that ground cover layer, but also it is managing water because I get a lot of pooling water there. This is a photo of Carex amphibula in a bioswale in Silver Springs, Maryland. And this is after 2 feet of snow have melted off of it. So you can see it really is mostly evergreen, especially for us here in North Carolina. The other sedge I'll come back to again is Carex cherokeeensis. It usually is found in the creekside areas and moist conditions, but it will handle those fluctuating water conditions really well. So this is a great rain garden plant. Carex grayi is another native sedge, which has these really cool, showy, star-shaped seed heads that has fantastic visual texture and looks fantastic in a bioswale. I'll also mention just too, there's a whole host of larger wetland sedges that do really well in these kind of stormwater or rain garden situations. There are a whole bunch of them. They tend to be pretty competitive. So these are ones I would use in a spot where you're okay with spreading and recognizing that they may be bullying out a few other plants, but especially in a spot that's maybe toward the back of a property or is not front and center, they're going to hold their own and they're going to outcompete a lot of the weeds that you might have to manage otherwise. All right. And then in the context of managing water where it falls, I cannot not mention switchgrass because this is one of our most tough and adaptable grasses really that's in the trade. It is a warm season grower, so it handles both heat and drought. But like many of our prairie species, when water is present, it will take it up very readily and it grows fantastically with more water. It provides nesting cover and food for wildlife. This is just a tough plant and it looks great in, for example, this community rain garden in Asheville. And I will talk a little bit more about switchgrass when I move into the next focus, but it's one I can't help but mention with rain gardens. And also they're just a host of perennials that are fantastic. I am going to run out of time and I want to make sure I get through more grasses. So I'm going to move on quickly and just see that, John, if running over just a few minutes would be okay. And folks, I know if they have to get off, they can go ahead and do that. Is that okay?
That's fine. And we can always share we'll share the recording with the guest list.
Okay, great. Well, I will keep moving pretty rapidly, but hope to get through it. I get so excited and there's so much to say that I get ahead of myself or behind in this case. So the last area I'll talk about in terms of focus and how do we add ecological function is really choosing plants for the resilience of the plant itself, but also for helping add resilience in the landscape. So can we have plants that are adaptable, but also look good? Because we know we want beautiful landscapes. We just want to add some function to them. So that is really an industry focus right now, and adding resilience and combining that with good looks. So you're seeing a lot of breeding work done in native selections. So finding cultivars of native species of grasses and sedges, also selecting for more compact size that'll fit into more managed landscapes, or that you have a lot more choices in terms of a species. So you can have some cultivars that add that same function, but in a shorter plant or more compact plant. Also not flopping. So one of the issues with a lot of our native prairie species is that when they are put in conditions of like fertile soils or have a lot of irrigation or even are fertilized, they can grow very lushly, but that growth can be lax and flop. So plant breeders are looking for selections that maybe won't respond in that way or won't flop. But also you can do that by choosing to put it in spots where it'll do better. So let me move on to some of those and mention again, switchgrass is one of these plants that's resilient and has good looks. We see it in all kinds of public spaces. And two of our tried and true cultivars are Shenandoah and North Wind. And you see those in the trade. They're out there a lot, and they're beautiful cultivars. I'll mention two newer ones, though, that are certainly worth taking a look at. One is called Purple Tears. This is one that was selected by Pete Aldoff from his garden in the Netherlands, and he shared it with us here in the US. And it is only about 4 feet tall, so about the same height as Panicum Shenandoah, but this one has this upright habit. It's a good size and has these beautiful flowering, has little tiny pink seed heads and kind of gray spikes. It is just lovely and a really nice size for a lot of our urban spaces as well. Another Panicum cultivar that I'll mention is Summer Sunrise. This one has a little bit broader blade. This is a green Panicum, so not red, but it will get some fall color that I will show you. And I like it because it has this really dense seed set. You get the light that captures it, so that's why we called it Summer Sunrise. It's just beautiful in the landscape. It has nice little pink seed heads and really nice, beautiful fall foliage. Another resilient native prairie species is little bluestem. And this, I'm happy to say, has been named the 2022 Perennial Plant of the Year by the Perennial Plant Association. So you're going to see a lot more about little bluestem in the coming months. And it's been named that with good reason. It's very adaptable, sun-loving, drought-tolerant. It's one that provides a lot of wildlife support. I mentioned earlier, it's a host for skipper butterflies, and it does a lot of these functions or adds these functions to the landscape that we've talked about for erosion control. You can put it on green roofs, meadow and prairie plantings. One of the keys, though, is it does need good drainage. It's one of those that it will not handle wet feet. So it needs to go maybe on the edge of a rain garden or in sandy soils, or where up on maybe a berm or a raised area where it can get good drainage. The blues is kind of one of our best cultivars out there. It's a very strong grower in the South and is just beautiful color throughout the growing season. It looks really nice. And it to me is one of my favorites. The one downside to the blues is that it will flop if you put it, or can flop, I should say, if you put it in those conditions, or you've got fertile soils or a lot of irrigation, or you have a lot of rainfall. So you want to put it in lean soils or in really dry conditions. But you can also select cultivars that have been bred not to flop. And one of those, and one of the best out there right now, is Standing Ovation. This is from North Creek Nurseries in Pennsylvania, and they have just a great selection. And a lot of the companion perennials I mentioned come from them and their lists. But Standing Ovation has been outstanding because it doesn't flop, even under those conditions I mentioned earlier. So you can put it in more richer soils, and you can provide it irrigation if it's an irrigated landscape, and it will still not flop. So we're really excited about this one. Has beautiful color, brilliant oranges and reds in the fall. So a really popular cultivar. And here's the super sneak peek that you get. There is a brand new one that is not even for sale in the US yet. This was shared with us by, it is part of the Pete Aldoff collection of grasses that are licensed in Europe. It was found in the US though, in the Haha-Tonka Preserve. And I think I've remembered it correctly. It's in Nebraska. I apologize. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is beautiful. And what is different about this one is it's got these lovely little hirsute stems, so little hairy stems that you can see in that photo really capture the sunlight. It is beautiful. So that, look for that probably in, oh gosh, 2022 at the earliest, maybe even 2023. And I will mention just a few others as I'm wrapping up here. Andropogon ternarius is a seed selection of one of our native prairie species that's found throughout the Southeast. Black Mountain was selected by a colleague of ours at the North Carolina Arboretum, and he found it on his family farm in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And that's why we named it Black Mountain. And the real bonus of Black Mountain cultivar is that it is more compact and predictable and comes out true to type from that seed, and that it is a more compact cultivar. So the typical Andropogon ternarius can range in height from just a few feet to 6 or 7 feet. It's very variable in the habit. And so Black Mountain gives you a little bit more predictability, especially for managed landscapes, but it is beautiful. And what I love about it and is just hard to beat is in the fall, you see these gorgeous seed heads. It's called split beard bluestem because that little inflorescence comes out and then splits, and you get these lovely little, almost like little twinkling stars. It's just beautiful in the sunlight. You can see here at the North Carolina Arboretum in their bonsai exhibit in this growing in the summer, and then in the fall, pow, it is absolutely gorgeous. And then a couple others I'll mention. Big bluestem is one of our prairie species that is just super tough and is great for wildlife support. So if you want, a pollinator garden, or you want to support birds, small mammals, this is a great one. I wanted to show you this picture because this is Andropogon gerardi, big bluestem, on a septic field. So what a creative way to add ecological function to that kind of very utilitarian landscape. And then a great selection of that is Black Hawks, which has deeper, richer color and a more compact habit. I'll also mention pink muley grass, which I think most folks are familiar with pink muley. It is a great species, especially in the Southeast, has beautiful seed heads, outstanding fall color. I would encourage you to try White Cloud, which is a cultivar of that. I like it for a couple of reasons, and I'm using it more now than pink muley because the white color lasts longer. So even into November and early December, it has the color still really pops in the landscape. It's more upright than pink muley grass, and it blooms about 2 weeks later for us than the pink muley. So you can have the sequence, especially if you use both of pink into white, and it will just take your breath away. And then the last grass I'll talk about, I think, is Muhlenbergia reversionii. This is rose muley. So this is a southwestern native, really very small region to it, but it is more cold hardy than the pink muley. And we find it may handle a little bit wetter conditions. And so that's a real plus for that. It's a little bit shorter, not quite as showy, but in colder areas where pink muley might have trouble overwintering, this is a great choice. And then there are a number of perennials that will handle these same conditions. So these are a few from North Creek's erosion control list. And so I will wrap up the plant list and the focus on function with reminding you about this landscape. And I hope that when you're thinking about these aspirations we have or these issues we might be managing in the landscape and adding ecological function, that you can see it's prime time for grasses and sedges for a reason. They offer smart solutions in our gardens. And I will leave you with just a few resources as I wrap up, because I want to make sure I show you some of these. Our website, I would invite you to visit and explore. We have plant profiles for all the plants I've mentioned. We also have a big, huge learn section, which I invite you to dive into and nerd out with me. There are downloads. You can download charts, lists, botanical and horticultural links. All the plants I've talked about are here. The recommendations for books, for planting designs, lots. Also, I need to note that we are a wholesale only. So please, as much as I love talking about grasses and sedges, we really can't take emails or calls unless you're in the trade. However, you can find our plants at local garden centers. We really encourage you to ask there first. But if you can't find them there, we do partner with an online mail order group called Isel Plants, and you can order liners directly from them. And I will say too, these are a number of books. I think John was going to share a PDF with a plant list and resources. So these are all resources and books from designers and plants folks that really know grasses and sedges well and use them in many of the ways we've talked about today. And then I also have to give a shout out to our friends at North Creek Nurseries. They have fantastic planting guides and that link there to their resources and links area. So I will wrap up. Thank you for your attention and letting me go over just a wee bit. I appreciate your attention and your interest, and I'm happy to stick around to answer any questions. So I will stop there.
I think we had two questions in the chat. One was, do you have tips for where to find these species if we do not have access to wholesale, which I think we, Isel plants and most of your good garden centers, they're going to be able to get a hold of this stuff. I always tell people that's what the independent garden centers do. They will, track down the plants for you. Some of the bigger chains, maybe not so much. But then do warm season grasses do well in cold northern climates? And I would say it's more, when you're saying warm and cold, that's referring to their growth cycle, not necessarily where they're going to actually grow.
Exactly. That's a great point. And I'm so glad someone asked that question, because I realized that maybe, yes, warm season grasses do fantastically in cool climates. In fact, some of the grasses I talked about are hardy up to zone 3, I think. I mean, it's crazy, but it really, I know we're not gardening as even 5, let's say Minnesota. But warm season grasses do very well in cooler climates. What they may not do is grow as much or as big, because they don't have as much time. The growing season's shorter, or they have less sunlight. So sometimes we get the benefit of being in where we are, and they grow really well. But yes, warm season grasses do just fine. I'll note there's a weird little in between here that I'll note, because I know some folks here probably know and appreciate Japanese forest grass. Heconocaloa macra is a beautiful grass that is warm season, but doesn't do well in our hot climates. And that is a different set of considerations, and that we know that there are some plants that, because our heat load in the Southeast is so high, so our nighttime temperatures are really high, right? Plants are trying to photosynthesize during the day and make a lot of fuel. And if the temperatures at night stay very high, the plant continues to respire and burn resources at a rate that outpaces their ability to photosynthesize during the daytime. So if you think about it, our hosta are never as big as they are in, like, say, New England, or honestly, even the difference between where you are in Winston-Salem and where we are in Durham. You're going to have bigger hostas. Just that the high nighttime temperatures are a killer, and really inhibit. What's the right word? They limit growth often for temperate plants. So that was the long answer to the short question.
I was asking, what are your top 3 favorite native grasses?
Oh, that's so hard. Okay. I would say, I'm going to say right now, how about that? I'm going to say Andropogon ternarius Black Mountain. And I know that's very specific, but it's one that will look good in lots of different landscapes. So right now, that's one of my favorites. Prairie Dropseed, so Spirobos, and I can type some of these in here. Oh, well, I'll tell you first, I'll type. Prairie Dropseed. And let's see, a third grass would be, right now I'm going to say little Bluestem. Can I put panicum in there too? I'm going to put panicum in there.
Sure.
Yeah. Sedges right now, y'all, I would say the bunny blue, the Carys bunny blue is right now kind of my fave, because it's looking really good. It's a great all around ground cover, and does a great job. So I'll slip that Carys in there. Other questions?
I think that's it for questions.
Okay, great.
Thank
you. And John, you'll be able to share the plant list with folks?
Yeah, everyone should have gotten.
Oh, great.
I think we had one late joiner, but I'll email that plant list out to y'all so you get it.
Wonderful.
And we'll also send, once the people that are more tech savvy than I am are, tidy this up and get it online, we'll share it. We're generally holding the videos to not to broadcast it to the public. We want to give our friends the benefit first.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I'm just thrilled you all joined me today, and I appreciate the opportunity. As you can tell, I'm pretty much love talking about this. So it's always a pleasure for me. So I hope that you learned some things about grasses and sedges today that you didn't already know, and that you will be as excited about them as I am.
Thank you, Shannon.
Sure.
Everyone keep in mind, we got more sessions coming up. Next week is sustainable gardening practices. We also have, Michelle is still doing a container, fall and winter container class. If you want to sign up for that, you can bring up to a 20-inch size container. I can definitely tell you that some of those Everillo and Evercolor sedges are perfect for fall containers. And that's coming up, I think, on the 26th of October. So keep that in mind. And we thank everyone for attending and for everyone's support of the gardens. So everyone have a good rest of the week, and let's hope we get some rain.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Take care.